The Lord's Prayer. Our Father who is in heaven, holy is your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
On more than one occasion, I have uttered the words, "Son, if you want to hear more yeses from me, make better requests." There's a lot of reasons why God says no. In fact, I was talking with Danita this morning. We spoke about some of the wonderful reasons. And they're the reasons you're more likely to hear on a sermon called When God Says No. But I'm going to be dealing with some stuff here that hopefully help us to reflect inward. Both in the original and in the remake of the Planet of the Apes, no is the first word that the apes learn on their progress toward world domination. In fact, in the remake, when the ape Caesar grabs the taser stick that the guy's beating with him, he screams no. And that is followed by 5 seconds of cinematic silence, showing us that even Hollywood understands the significance of the word no in the human vocabulary. Although if you've ever watched any of the other animals, the species around us, they all have their own way of saying no. I was watching a documentary on lions, and you know, the big male lion had his belly full, and he's lying there under a tree, and it's just at that time the little cubs think, this will be the time to climb all over Dad. And so they're jumping on his head and trying to bite his fly-swishing tail, and you see it on the camera. He's just lying there, and every now and then he opens one of those eyes of his, and he's just waiting for one of those little cubs to come within reach, and then boom, pinned. Not long after that, there was a few hyenas who got a different kind of no, but it's a keen observation. Whoever wrote Planet of the Apes to make no the word that is so prominent in the movie, such is its significance on vocabulary. In fact, as we discussed last week, those who build upon the rock, I'm not sure how much thought you've ever given as to how that is actually meant to function within the human conscience, or within a church, or within a community, or within or the church within society. That as the world ceaselessly comes up with their endless nonsense and ridiculousness, all of which prowl around like a roaring lion looking for the vulnerable and the weak to devour, it's the church. It's no surprise that this nonsense runs through the halls of our education system. No surprise that it runs through the halls of media. Not even a surprise that it runs through the political halls. But it's when it hits the church, it's here that these ideas are meant to crash into non-existence as we tell them no. Because when the church in society, when the church fails to say no, it's over. It's over. It's only a matter of time. And in fact, not only are our churches not saying no anymore to this nonsense that comes, we're often found to be the ones promoting it. Such is the degree of cowardice often found within Christianity these days. Parents, of course, function in the same way. You know, the kids, off they run, out at sea, dreaming up the next big wave of how it would be a great idea to skip the vegetables and only eat chocolate. And where does that wave end? On the rock that is mom. Or perhaps, maybe it's not bedtime. Maybe it's time to jump on the bed for another hour and a half until that idea reaches the rock that is dad. And he says no. Because we've all witnessed what happens to children whose ideas never hit a rock. Children who are allowed to do whatever they want, whenever they want, however they please. And it's by no coincidence that these children never seem to be among the healthiest children, or leading the athletic teams, or functioning academically better than anyone else. In fact, back in my day in Glasgow, they were always the kids that seemed to be toothless, the chocolate already having rotted out their mouths, and children who, because there was no bedtime structure, were falling over their desks, tired and bedraggled, practically ensuring failure down the road. So right off the bat, when we're contemplating as to why God says no to us, or when God says no to us, it's good for us to remember that it's a horrendous outcome for children who never hear the word no. In fact, putting Bub to bed on the days that he has visits with two adults who don't know the meaning of the word no, and then he comes back into a house that actually has rules, it's an enraging sight to witness, trying to get him to sleep. Not his fault. So when God says no, if we're not paying attention and taking the time to understand why, theologically we end up like those children who never seem to grow up. We live the rest of our Christian lives like children, grown men and women, 20, 30, 40 years in the church and still capable of throwing tantrums like a teenager. Still drinking milk, even after decades. Still incapable of handling anything beyond the goo-goos and the gagas of theology. Why do churches die? Because invariably, eventually, they often fall into the hands of children. Leaders who are not leaders. They're children. Appointed as elders sometimes because, well, I don't know, because they're popular. Not because of anything biblical, but because they're popular. Appointed because, well, I don't know, he's been coming here now for 30 or 40 years, time served. Appointed because perhaps they've been successful in business. Appointed perhaps because, well, if you don't appoint them, they're going to take their family and their finances and they're going to leave. And instead of waving good riddance to this immaturity, whereby at any level would have the audacity to hold the Church of Jesus Christ to ransom, instead of saying no to these infants, we appoint them, those who lack the maturity and wisdom and experience to lead. I was in two minds whether to say the next thing all morning, all week actually, because the last thing I want to do is embarrass our elders. But I think you do need to know that from a preacher's point of view, it is an absolute delight, and I don't use that word lightly, an absolute delight to serve alongside. All three of them, used to be four, so I'm including you, Clay, But all 3, 4 of them, a delight to serve beside men who so obviously love God and so sincerely love the church and so anxious to do what is right by you and by God. I hope you realize, I know you don't often get out and about in other churches, so you might not know what's out there. After 35 years in ministry, trust me, I know what's out there. And what you have in leadership right now is beyond precious. And if you don't appreciate it and don't treasure it, then more fool us. But the other elderships that I've seen that lack the experience, that lack the wisdom, well, they go on to hire preachers because the elders don't know any better. They go on to hire preachers that don't know any better. The preachers themselves, children, incapable of providing anything but chocolate. There's no rules in place. There's no insistence upon godly standards because the preachers themselves are children. They're still at the stage where they're chasing popularity from the congregation. Yay, everybody loves me. Well, of course everybody loves you, you moron. You never tell them no. Theologically, eventually, a congregation like that will devolve into the church's equivalent of the Lord of the Flies, because no one ever had the courage to say no. There's no other way, scripturally, there's no other way to view the flood, Babel, the 10 plagues on Egypt, the decimation of Israel at the hands of Assyria and Babylon and Rome. There's no other way to view that than a parental no. No. Now, I was debating whether to bring this up, but if I don't bring it up, some people will mention it. And so, when dealing with the subject of God saying no, many people turn to Jesus in the garden when Jesus says, "Take this cup from me, yet not what I will be done, but you will." So I might as well deal with this to save people from wondering why I excluded it as an example of God saying no. Because I don't think God answered that prayer, "Take this cup from me." I don't think he answered it with a no. In fact, I know that he answered that prayer with a yes. That the particular cup Jesus was referring to was removed. Because what is common when we talk about that area in Jesus' life, "Take this cup from me," is often presented as Jesus trying to avoid the crucifixion of all things. And so God's response to that is, "No, you're doing it whether you want to or not," which has major theological implications that we don't want to have to talk about. And it's understandable that people would make the connection, particularly because in John 18, Jesus specifically mentions the cross as a cup. But even in John 18, when Jesus does that, he rebukes Peter, saying, "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" And on another occasion, he calls Peter Satan for daring to question the righteousness of the cross. And it's also understandable given the popularity of the opinion, but I believe it's a mishandling of the text to suggest that Jesus is asking for the cup of crucifixion to be removed. Look, if anyone knew that the cross was the plan of God that was laid before the foundations of the world and prophesied that it would take place, if anyone knew that, it would be Jesus. And therefore, to have Jesus requesting it to be removed 5 minutes before it's to be implemented doesn't only come across as silly, it presents Jesus as being ignorant of the unfolding plan of God and the necessity of the cross. And especially this is so considering that only a short time before the cross, Jesus himself triumphantly said, "The hour has come, the Son of Man is to be glorified. Now my heart is troubled, but what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it was for this very reason I came to this hour." But his heart being troubled is the key, because that's also the immediate context for the cup statement in Mark's account. Jesus saying, "My soul is overwhelmed my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Understand, he's not exaggerating. So listen to what he's saying. He's saying to his Father, my soul, my entire being is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Then he says, "Take that cup from me, or I might die before I even get to the cross." And immediately following that statement, Luke has the angel arriving to answer the prayer. The Hebrew writer reminding us that Jesus' prayers were heard because of his reverent submission. So the opposite is true. The prayer is answered with a yes. An angel even arrived to deliver it personally, strengthening him, the text says. So it wasn't the cross that Jesus was asking to be removed. It was this overwhelming sorrow that he perceived might interfere with it. And as he sees the glorification of his Father on the horizon, his request is, "Father, you need to help me. I'm feeling as though I'm about to die here. There's a good chance I might not make it to the cross." It's not the cross he wants removed. It's what's keeping him from getting to the cross that he wants removed. "Not my will, but your will be done," is Jesus saying to him, "Look, if you want me to go, I'm telling you, I feel I'm overwhelmed to the point of death. Now, if you're insisting that this is how I go to the cross, then so be it. But I'd prefer some help." And what happens? God sends an angel, the angel strengthens him, and the rest is history. So do we not have any example then of Jesus being told no? No. Of course we don't. Why? Because Jesus didn't pray our prayers. In fact, half his time was spent trying to get us to pray his prayers. It's inconceivable, wholly inconceivable that Jesus would make a request outside the will of God. "I always do what is pleasing to the Father," he says. Always. Sometimes I think, although we say it often, I think sometimes we genuinely struggle to get it through our heads that this life that we remember and celebrate, perfect, flawless, faultless, and faithful. So what we can have Jesus asking is to be equipped in order to carry out the job that God had sent him to accomplish. That is a righteous request. But for God saying no, well, we got to go elsewhere. Passages like James 4, where James says, "You don't have because you don't ask. And when you ask, you don't receive because you ask with the wrong motives, that you might spend whatever you get on your pleasures." So, is that mine? He's about to hear a no. So, right off the bat, James informs us that we often receive a no from God because our request is wrongly motivated. It's selfishly motivated. Arguably, what's the most striking about the prayer that Will recited for us, when Jesus taught us to pray, the most striking thing about that prayer is the absence of self. The absence of me, myself, and I. Our Father, give us, forgive us, as we also forgive our. Lead us, deliver us. But firstly, James says, you don't have because you don't ask. Well, who wouldn't ask? Well, that's self-explanatory, right? Who wouldn't ask? Well, the people who wouldn't ask are typically those kind of people who think that life should just revolve around them and that everything should just fall at their feet from the magical land of blessing. It never seems to bother them that even Jesus himself lived by asking is the rule of the kingdom. And I don't know, but maybe they've yet to experience what all of us probably at one point or another have experienced at some point. Probably when we were a younger Christian and perhaps an older brother or sister had to take us aside at one point and remind us that, contrary to personal opinion, the church doesn't revolve around you. And that not everybody in the church is sitting all week just thinking about you and how you're doing. In the same way that you're not spending your week worrying about everybody else in the church and wondering what they're up to. Well, in exactly the same way, when it comes to prayer, and I hope this doesn't come as a shock to anyone, but God isn't revolving his world around you either. God is not revolving his world around me either. That as far-fetched as it might seem, that maybe, just maybe, God isn't on the edge of his seat every morning, desperately waiting to see how he can orchestrate the entire world so that I can get a parking spot 10 feet closer to Walmart. It's one of the contentions that arises within Scripture. One of the places of friction between God and Israel, the prophets in Israel, Jesus and the apostles and then the church, and now preachers with the church. The friction that arises between trying to describe and explain to the church just how precious you are to God and how valuable you are to God, without trying to convince you that everybody believes you hung the moon. Because that's when it becomes the problem, right? You don't have because you don't ask. Because not asking is to treat God like some kind of a maid whose only job in life is to make sure everything around you is tidy and neat. And you don't even have to ask. I can't talk about everybody else's experience with God, but I can talk about mine. And from where I'm standing and the things that I've experienced with God, I'm letting you know, if it's never happened to you, then I'm letting you know that it is not beyond our Father's ability to whisper into our ears, who do you think you are? Just who do you think you are? And sometimes Sometimes that huge paw that has us pinned in life and frustrated, sometimes it's from the Lion of the tribe of Judah. No. One day when Israel began to swagger and forget who exactly they were and forget their story, God said this to them through Ezekiel. No one looked on you with pity. No one had compassion on you. Rather, you were thrown out into the open field, for on the day that you were born, you were despised. Then I passed by and I saw you kicking around in your own blood. And as you lay there in your own blood, I said to you, live. I made you grow like a plant of the field. You grew up and developed and became the most beautiful of jewels. Your breasts were formed and your hair grew. You who were naked and bare. Later I passed by, and when I looked at you and saw that you were old enough for love, I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine. I bathed you with water and washed the blood from you and put ointments on you. I clothed you with an embroidered dress and put leather sandals on you. I dressed you in fine linen and covered you with costly garments. I adorned you with jewelry. I put bracelets on your arms and a necklace around your neck. I put a ring in your nose, earrings on your ears, and a beautiful crown on your head. So you were adorned with gold and silver. Your clothes were of fine linen and costly fabric and embroidered cloth. Your food was fine flour, honey, and olive oil. You became very beautiful and rose to be a queen. And your fame spread among the nations on account of your beauty. I had given you your beauty and made it perfect, declares the sovereign Lord. And then he continues. You think I did all that for you so that you could swagger? You think I did all that for you so that you could look down on others? Later still through the apostle. Who are you? Or who do you think you are to judge another man's servant? To his own master he will stand or fall. And then Paul thunders, and he will stand, for God is able to make him stand. And then when you do ask, James continues, you don't get it. Because your request is all about you. Because it's always all about you and what you get to spend on you. Sometimes no is something that God finds particularly useful to slap the swagger out of us. To spank the pride away from us. You know what's wrong with this church? Someone said to me one time in Glasgow. Now in Glasgow, we get to speak a little bit more freely than we do over here. So I'll try and do my best with how I answered him. You know what's wrong with this church? I don't think he thought I was about to laugh. In fact, his tone suggested that he thought I was about to take out a notepad and a pen. But laugh I did. And I said to him, do I know what's wrong with this church? Of course I do. We're all as broken and as pathetic at living as you are. That's what's wrong with this church. But forgive me, let me take notes, and forgive me for noticing that Solomon had been reincarnated in front of me. Tell me, O wise one. He didn't leave my presence without being reminded that this church just so happened to be the bride of Christ. And that before he says another word, he might want to ponder them. I've watched husbands when their wives are insulted. You know what's wrong with this church? Choose your next words very, very carefully. Rumor has it Jesus is in love with his bride. So sometimes no. Because why should he? In fact, if the person in front of him who is doing the asking, standing there swaggering, standing there looking down on others, if that's who's doing the asking, and that attitude is a result of God blessing him and saying yes to him, then why would he? Why would he bless such an individual? If every time he blesses the individual, he only becomes more proudful and more judgmental, why would a father then bless? That would be to hurt the child. In the bulletin, I wrote about the spirit of Cain. That demon of jealousy that seeks to destroy those foolish and immature enough to entertain it. So sometimes no. Because when we more resemble Cain than we do Abel, when we are more consumed about our brother's sacrifice and our brother's offering than what we bring, when we are more fixated over who has what and why, and well, by jingo, if I was God, I would make sure the right people had it. When we're more consumed by what everybody else has. Remember the end of John's Gospel? I love this. The end of John's Gospel. When I read the end of John's Gospel, especially John's Gospel, which is, I hope we get into it, especially if we go to small group, that book will blow your mind apart. So especially John's Gospel, when it ends, the way it ends, with Jesus saying, feed my sheep, and then this portion that I'm going to talk about, it almost reads like an anticlimax. You know, Matthew and Mark end with, go into all the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation. You know, it ends kind of triumphantly. And John seems to end comparatively like a damp squid. And then it dawned on me, well, that's only because you're not seeing it right. That's because the enormity of what's being said is lost on you. It's only because you think it's trivial, Billy. It's obviously not trivial if John is ending his gospel with it. Remember, Peter and Jesus had the conversation. Do you love me, Peter? Feed my sheep. Do you love me, Peter? Feed my sheep. Do you love? And then what happens? Peter looks behind him and he sees John approaching. And Peter says to Jesus, what about him? And what does Jesus say? What's he got to do with you? What's he got to do with you? I just told you 2 minutes ago, Peter, what I'm asking from you, feed my sheep. And 2 seconds into it, you're already worried about someone else. Oh, it's not small at all. And particularly because it finds itself right at the end of the gospel. Forced me to understand the significance of that. Sometimes when I'm back in Scotland and I'm riding in my best friend's car, John, he's brilliant at this. As we're driving along the road, every now and then, when I've had enough of it, I usually say to him, John, isn't it exhausting? And he'll say, what? And I'll say, driving every other car on the road. Because he comments on every other driver and how they're doing and like, isn't it exhausting? Don't you have enough in your own little car to keep you going? That you got to spend your life worrying about everybody else's? I've met Christians like that. Experts on all the other cars in the church. Expert on every life except their own. Man, I've got some stories that would curl your toes. But let me tell you about one. You'll think I'm making this up. I am not making this up. When I was preaching in Tucson, I preached an Easter sermon that apparently wasn't Eastery enough for someone. So they came into my office and they thought they rebuked me. That was his intention, to rebuke me for preaching such an un-Eastery sermon on Easter. I didn't know it at the time. It came up in hindsight. But later on I found out when I did I calculated the dates. At the same time that man was in my office lecturing me on a sermon not being Eastery enough, he was having an affair on his wife. The audacity of humanity has long since ceased to amaze me. Another guy who stayed with Sarah and I for 5 years, rent-free, all his food. Sarah washed his clothes, all for free, 5 years. One of the other members of the church gave him 2 cars. We bought him a trailer. And his exit from our congregation was a judgment that we didn't do enough for him. It's staggering. So focused. It's the spirit of Cain. Not content with what you can bring. God. So when God says no, when that paw comes down, when the answer is no, what do your children ask? Why? Right? When children are told no, and invariably they say, why? That's my encouragement to you this morning. When it's no, the focus should be inward. Why? But when God does say no, that's the times we trust. We trust that He meant what He promised when He said He would save us. We trust that a no is no because a yes would hurt us. We trust that when we asked Him to save us, that's precisely what He's doing. And so this no, however uncomfortable or frustrating it might be, nevertheless is toward that end. And perhaps if we're quiet enough for long enough, we'll maybe hear God whispering into our ears what I often whisper into my own children's ears. If you want to hear more yeses from your daddy, make better requests. Thank you.